Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We have been in Genesis chapter 11, and we read an interesting story last week about the Tower of Babel, where Nimrod, this great leader of men, builds this tower. I guess you could say kind of a monument to himself, and we learned some lessons about people who get a little too big-headed and think a little too much about themselves, as opposed to people who honor God in their lives. So Nimrod kind of is the bad example as to how to live your life. But we also kind of got a sense of what was happening in the world at that time. Of course, we've already gone through this flood with Noah and his family. We know that they got off the ark, and then they started repopulating the earth. And Noah has his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We talked a little bit about each one of them and how Noah had sort of given a little blessing while he puts a curse on Ham. We talked about that. And he also gives kind of a blessing to Shem and Japheth. And what we're going to be looking at today is the descendants of Shem. Because immediately following the story of the Tower of Babel, you have the genealogy of Shem. You remember, we've already talked about genealogies and what they're all about, but this is another one that we're going to be looking at. But I don't want you to worry, we're not going to spend time reading through lists of names. We're just going to kind of hit the highlights on that. But we're going to focus our attention on somebody who is very important in the Bible. And this is where mention of him is made, the first time he's mentioned. His name is Abram. You might have heard of Abraham, but at this point his name is Abram. And later on he gets renamed. So I have to remember to refer to him as Abram instead of Abraham until we get a little further down in the story. So we look at chapter 11, and basically right after the Tower of Babel, verse 11, chapter 11, verse 11, this is the account of Shem's family line. And that's what the beginning here after the Tower of Babel in verse 10. And then you have a whole bunch of names, just like you do in all the genealogies. If you're curious and you want to add up all the different numbers of how long they lived, you might be able to get a bigger sense of how much time has gone on. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to kind of zip through all those names and skip all them and get down to the end of that list where it says, it mentions somebody named Terah. He is the last one, almost the last one in this genealogy of Shem. It says, after Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abraham. I did it wrong. Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And this is kind of the basis of our story when we think about who Abram was. So Abram's father was Terah, and he's got two brothers, and we're going to see how that all sort of works together. Now we go after the genealogy is over, we learn a little bit more about the story behind Abram and what happens in his life. This is the beginning of his story. And so just a few things we learn in the rest of chapter 11, verse 31. It says that Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. And then it goes on to say how Terah lived 205 years, and then he dies. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, we've got a number of names here. We've got Abram and his two brothers, and one of those brothers, we learn, dies when he's younger. And he was the father of Lot. So Lot is Abram's nephew. And it's important to know that because Lot comes into some of the other other stories in the Bible, and we need to know where he comes from and what his relationship is to Abram. So he's Abram's nephew. You almost get the sense that maybe Abram sort of took him under his wing because Lot's father, Abram's brother, had died when he was young. And I think we're learning something already about the character of Abraham in the way that he takes this orphaned, I don't know if you call him orphan, but he lost his father, and Abram takes his nephew under his wing, so to speak. So this is kind of the family relationship we got going here, and of course it mentions Abram's wife Sarah, and Sarai, her name gets changed later on too. So we have to keep track of what we want to call them at any given time. So that's pretty much wraps up chapter 11. Then we get into chapter 12 and we learn some more things. This is where the actual storyline starts to develop. In chapter 12 in verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And I guess I should backtrack a little bit here and remember that when Abram and his father had left the land of Ur, we read that in the last verse, they were commissioned to go, they planned on going to the land of Canaan, but it says they stopped in Haran. And Abram at this point has not continued his trip, his journey up to Canaan. But this is God kind of tapping him on the shoulder, I guess you could say, and reminding him, or maybe commanding him to get back on the road and to finish this trip which they started out on. Now, we don't really know the details as to why they stopped in Haran, but maybe we can learn a few lessons there. It's possible that maybe Abram's father was just getting too old to travel and complete the journey. We don't know. But we do know, and again from the last verse we read, it says that while they were in Haran, they greatly prospered. It says specifically, business must have been good there, life must have been good there, because Abraham was able to add to his wealth, servants and donkeys and camels and, this is how you measured your wealth, sheep and goats and all that kind of stuff. So life was good in Haran, but God is now tapping him on the shoulder and telling him, get back on the road and complete this journey that you and your father had started out on so long ago. So this is a commission. But along with this commission comes a promise, and this promise is very important. In 12 verse 2 and 3, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you." Wow, this is kind of a big thing here. This is a promise that God is making to Abraham, that I will make from you a great nation. And it's important that we take a minute here to understand the significance of this promise that God is making to Abraham, because we actually call this the Abrahamic covenant. And what is a covenant? Well, covenant, I think we had talked about that word before. It's like an agreement that somebody makes, almost like a legal contract. But when God says he's going to do something, we call that a covenant. And now maybe you don't remember, but we've already had two covenants that we've looked at. The first one was the Adamic covenant that promised that God made to Adam and Eve that he would send someone, the seed of the woman, into the world to crush the head of Satan. The next covenant is the promise that God makes to Noah. We call that, of course, the Noahic covenant. And that is the promise that he wouldn't destroy the world again with a flood. And, that's kind of important. That's nice to know. But now this is the third covenant that we recognize in the Bible. And this is God's promise to Abraham that he's going to do something very special in his life, Abram's life. And he's going to make from him a great nation. So this is kind of an important thing, and that's why Abram is such an important person in the Bible, and we want to know a few things about him. And the other thing, besides knowing about Abram, I think we want to look at his character, and we want to learn some things that we can apply to our own lives. And that's kind of where we're headed here. But we'll continue on, and we'll see what we learn about Abram in this very early part of his life. So, in verse 4, after this promise is made, it says that Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So isn't this interesting? He's taking all the stuff that he accumulated when he was in Haran, and he was not just hearing the voice of God and the command of God, but he was actually obeying God. That's kind of important. You can get some direction from God and kind of ignore it, but Abraham wasn't willing to do that. And I really have to appreciate the fact that he's willing to do this when he's 75 years old. I mean, I just turned 75 last year, and I'm not about to, pull up roots and try to do something new in my life. I'm kind of happy where I am, and God has greatly blessed me and my family here. And the idea of just pulling them up and, taking off to some strange place, and it's interesting, he commands him to go to a place where I will show you. I think generally Abram was aware of the fact that they were going up towards Canaan, but it was a big unknown to him. Nobody that he knew had ever been there. It was just this command from God. And the fact that he was willing to do that when he was so old and really prosperous, that makes it kind of hard to change your lifestyle too. When you've gotten comfortable and you found, this is a cool place and I can just be happy here the rest of my life. But he was willing to follow God, and I think that's a real example for us. So, verse 6 of chapter 12, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem, and at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So this is, kind of step by step God is leading him. Now at this point, he's traveled, he's just on the verge of going into this land that God was directing him to. And he sees, first of all, that it's not empty, it's occupied. It talks about the Canaanites who were there. And of course, it's important to know that because they come into the story a little bit later as well. But God reaffirms this promise, or I guess maybe you could say he clarifies it a little more, because once Abram is standing there looking at this land, God says, "To your offspring I will give this land. This land will be given to you and your offspring." And that is kind of important, because that's really what most of the Old Testament is about, is Israel taking possession of this land and maintaining it and building their lives there in this land. And so we'll wrap up the story part by reading verse 8. From there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Now, I'm not real sure exactly where Bethel or Ai was, but it's in the land of Canaan, and probably somebody could fill us in on exactly where that was. Some of those places, they were so long ago, they're not real sure where they were, but we know generally he was in the land of what we call now Israel. So, but it's interesting because we see this something consistent about him, and it talks about how he built an altar when God made this promise to him. And it also uses this phrase that he called on the name of the Lord. So this is another important thing we learn about Abram. He's willing to, put the pedal to the metal, as it were, and actually do what God tells him to do. And he honors God, and you get the sense that he's seeking God in every step of the way, and that God is speaking to him. And that's important. And, that's a wonderful thing. But how do we wrap this up? Now, I came up with 5 different lessons that we learn from Abram, and that we can apply to our own lives. Because, none of us are called to do what Abraham was called to do. God, you go through the Bible, and every once in a while God points his finger at a certain person and says, I want you to do this. And he has a specific job for that person to do. And we can think, well, those are Bible people, and God did that, only in special people. But really, as we talked about this before, God has a plan for every single one of us. Now, it might not be to be the father of a nation, but that's okay, because God has something in mind for each one of us to do to help build his kingdom. And when we look at people like Abraham, we can learn some really, I have to stop calling him Abraham. He's not Abraham yet. He's Abram. And we can learn some really great lessons from him. So we start out by this fact that he calls on God. And that's something that we can do as well. If you're not quite sure where you're going, or you're not quite sure what God wants you to do, he asks us to call on him through prayer. And we can hear from him now through his word. So that's a really good example that Abram sets for us. The other thing is that Abram received from God a specific direction, the direction in which he should go. And I think, we can have that same sense of the direction that we are to take if we stay close to God, we keep listening to him, then he will direct our paths. And he is a light unto my path, it says in the Psalms. And I think this is one thing that we clearly see in the life of Abraham. But the other thing is, and we already mentioned this, you got to be willing to go. It's not enough to know that God wants you to do something. You really, sometimes the big stickler here in walking a life of faith and, honoring God and following God is the fact that we just don't want to do it. You might know what's right. You might know the direction that God wants you to go in, but, it's hard to break that inertia and to get started. That's why I'm thinking it must have been hard for Abram at 75 to, head off in this new venture of faith, this new walk of faith. So we do need to be willing to go, and that's still true today. It's also interesting, this whole little thing about Haran, how they spent, Abram's father was commissioned to go to Canaan, but he ends up stopping at Haran, and we don't really know why. But there are times in our lives where God seems to be bringing us to some sort of a detour, and we think we know the direction we're heading, but it seems like God is putting these obstacles in our way. But it was interesting because it said very clearly that when they were in Haran, they greatly prospered. And so, this was maybe part of God's plan to bless Abram and to give him, this great wealth in order to establish himself in this new land. And I think we'll see in days to come that that's pretty much what happened. But there are these times in our lives when God will use maybe a difficult circumstance, something difficult, and usually he accomplishes some very important things in us to build our character. Sometimes the difficult experiences are actually more valuable to us than, the good times, because they teach us very important lessons about faith in building our character. And so these little detours, or maybe you could say like a layover that you get that you weren't expecting, and you got to wait around, and it doesn't seem like you're progressing in the way that you're supposed to go. But God very often has a purpose for those types of things that happen. And then finally, we see his example of living a godly life. And certainly anybody that follows God, and if we're trying to live a life pleasing to God and, obeying his direction, living a godly life would obviously be a kind of a no-brainer that that's what God would want from us. So there's a lot more really exciting things that happen in the life of Abram, soon to become Abraham. And I think we can, as we go through the story, it's important to know the things that happened to him because he's such an important person in the Bible and so many things relate to him. But also, simultaneously, we want to think about what we learned from him in terms of our own lives. So I hope this has been a blessing as we begin our story of the life of Abram, and we're going to continue that next time. So I hope you can join us as we do on Gen Z Bible Class.